I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. This is my old standby radio, the Taranis X9D. And you know what? No matter how many other radios I have tried, the X-Lite, the Nirvana, the Horus X10S, the Horus X12S, no matter how many other radios have come along that have been better than the X9D in some way, nothing has gotten me to abandon it. The whole package of this radio is, to me, just the best you can get. Hall effect gimbals, good layout that makes all the switches available to you. OpenTX, which for a nerd like me is a must-have. No matter what all those other radios brought to the table, they made me give up one of those things, and I'm just not willing to do it. But that all might change today, because today we're looking at the Jumper T16, and it's pretty freaking good. If you guys notice that there's some light coming in the background and maybe you hear some birds and some trees in the background, it's one of the first beautiful days of spring here in Tennessee, and I cannot resist having the window open while I record. So apologies if there's a little background noise or your dog starts barking at the birds you hear. I gotta do it, guys. Okay, let's talk about the Jumper T16. I've tried a lot of radios with radical changes to the form factor of this basic formula that has been how a RC transmitter looks for freaking ever. One of them that comes to mind is the X-Lite, the FrSky X-Lite. One of them that comes to mind is the Nirvana from Underground FPV and FlySky. And another one that comes is the Turnigy Evolution. Some of them try to look like game controllers. Then the Nirvana, I don't know what it's trying to look like. It's just trying to reinvent the whole thing from scratch. And I got to tell you, for all the ways that those things kind of work, I've never really loved them. Maybe that's just because I'm a traditionalist. Maybe it definitely has to do with the fact that I pinch the sticks instead of using thumbs, especially the game controller styled ones like the X-Lite and the Evolution are much, much better for thumbs. Frankly, the Nirvana is a little better if you do thumbs, although it works. I just like this traditional form factor. None of those others have ever won me over, although the Nirvana comes close. So when we look at the T16, it hasn't done anything new, and I love it for that. It's got the same light up screen as the X10 and the X12, but unlike the X10 and the X12, it's not this gigantic. The X10 has these freaking angles on it. It's like, do you know that a human hand is going to be touching this radio, FrSky? So it's like, oh, I finally get the great screen of the X10, and it's got all the interface of the X10, the custom widgets you can put on the screen, but I don't have to have a great big honkin' heavy, bulky, breakable X10. Oh my goodness. I'm so freaking happy about this radio so far. So the ergonomics are pretty good. They're pretty much the same as any other of this style of radio. I have no problem with them. All the switches are where you would expect them to be. 2-position here, momentary here, 3-position, everything else identical to the Taranis X9D, and I'm used to and like that setup. We got 2 potentiometers here, 2 knobs, and we have slider potentiometers here, unlike the Taranis, which has this style a potentiometer here. These are, it doesn't really matter, frankly, because to be honest with you, as a mini quad pilot, I almost never use these sliders at all anyway, but there they are. I do find that these side sliders are a little too easy to bump when I'm moving my finger to manipulate the switches, whereas on the Taranis, I simply never have that problem. A really common modification to FrSky radios is to add a 6-position rotary switch in the place of one of the potentiometer knobs. What that means is that instead of a continuously variable knob that you turn, there's a knob with 6 positions, and people like to use that for flight modes, especially fixed wing pilots, or just whatever you might want to select one of 6 options. Jumper has given you the same functionality here with these flight mode buttons at the top. It's not a rotary switch. You just press 1, 2, 3, 4, and you can use OpenTX's mixing functionality to set that up any way you want. It's just another input that can have 6 positions. It is nice that you don't actually have to give up one of your potentiometers to do it. Jumper has added that to the radio, and you can have that, or you can use it or not use it as you see fit. Speaking of things that Jumper added, if you look at the trim switches, you might be a little confused. There's trim 1, 2, 3, and 4 for your main 4 axes, and trim 5 and 6. And those are just 2 additional trim switches that Jumper has added. They're essentially momentary switches that you can do whatever you want with. They don't affect the trims or outputs of your 4 main control channels. It's just an extra momentary switch. Well, you could use it for whatever you want. It really seems like Jumper is targeting OpenTX nerds like me with these extra switches. What do? I don't know. Do whatever you want with them, please. And I couldn't be happier. One of the biggest complaints about the X9D and the QX7 has been its user interface. OpenTX doesn't have a terribly intuitive user interface, although if you're a nerd like me, you do get used to it. But the screen on the X9D and especially the QX7 is not that big. It's not beautiful to look at. It's not a color screen. About the only thing it has going for it is long battery life. The FrSky Horus X10 introduced a much better interface, but I really didn't like the overall ergonomics of that radio. The Jumper T16 gives us the exact interface that the X10 had, but in a much more user-friendly form factor. So here we can see on the screen, it's a much larger screen. We have many more lines of information, both vertically and horizontally. It's colorful. There's customizations to it. You can put widgets up here that have specific data about your flight. You can customize this screen much more than you could customize anything on the X9D or the QX7. However, the overall layout of the menus will be very familiar to anyone who's familiar with OpenTX. This is OpenTX at its core. So if I press the menu key here, here's my model set up. And as I scroll down, timers, everything that you're used to seeing is still there. It's just in a much nicer form factor to work with in the field. Now, this screen does have a downside, and that is battery life. The screen never turns off. It's not possible to have the screen turn off when you're not using it. It can dim, and in fact, you can see it did dim there, but it is always on, and that's going to cause your batteries to run down faster. I have in this radio a 2500 milliamp hour 3-cell pack that fits right in the back here, and this thing lasts me 3 weeks easily, maybe a month or more, depends on how much flying I do. With the T16, they've done something really clever. They've set it up to use 18650 cells, and it comes with a battery tray specifically for 18650 cells. It's basically, you would have your own 18650 cells that you can recharge using a standard 18650 charger, and then you can just change them out in the field as you need be. And this is nice. I run my Fat Shark goggles off of 18650 cells. There's all kinds of, it seems to be the way these transmitters are going. It's great that they included the tray with it, as opposed to making you buy a 2-cell aftermarket battery and giving you a crappy little AA tray that no one's ever going to use. You can also put a 2-cell LiPo in here if you prefer. This is not going to be doing in-radio charging though, no matter what you do. So you will be taking these out to charge them. And that is one thing that some radios like the Nirvana, the underground FPV Nirvana, definitely have over a radio like this. It was stuck in there because I pinched the wire. There we go. So is it? What am I doing here? Let's see. When I'm putting it in like this, I'm pinching the wires. I actually think it would be better to put it in like this. It is a little loose in there. So you may want to put just a little bit of foam in here or something to keep it from rattling around. Pinching the wires also keeps it from rattling around, but I don't think that's good for the long-term health of the radio. We can't talk about any radio without talking about the gimbals. And the gimbals on this radio are, unfortunately, they are not Hall effect gimbals. I wish that they were. Hall effect gimbals are superior to potentiometer-based or brushed gimbals in basically every way. They use a magnetic sensor to detect the gimbal position, and that means that they last a lot longer. My Taranis gimbals, the original ones that I had, lasted about 6 months to a year before I had to replace them. And the way you know that you need to replace them is that in beta flight, the stick stops recentering exactly right. It'll be centering at like 1509 instead of 1500. So you readjust your subtrims and it recenters correctly now. And then a week later, suddenly it's not recentering anymore. And that means that your gimbals are wearing out and they need to be replaced. With the Hall effect gimbals in the Taranis, that just doesn't happen. They just last, well, basically forever. I mean, eventually the ball bearings or the plastic crossbar will wear out, but realistically, that's going to take a really long freaking time. So the T16 doesn't have Hall effect gimbals, and that would be one of the main things that would stop me from making it my primary radio. Not that there's some ephemeral feel. The gimbal just doesn't feel as smooth, or people are such gimbal snobs and I just don't get it. They're like, oh, this gimbal, I love how the tension builds as I move the stick. And I'm just like, I don't know, I'm just flying with it. I'm not the reviewer to tell you about that. But I will say that I would anticipate if I use this as my primary radio, that 6 months or 8 months from now, I would be replacing the gimbals. And that would annoy me. So Jumper, Hall effect gimbals. Give me a $200 version of this radio with Hall effect gimbals and one other thing, and I'm going to be pretty freaking happy. As far as the ergonomics of the gimbals go, yeah, it's not bad. They are standard throw gimbals, the same throw distance as the FrSky M9. So if you like the FrSky R series gimbals with the shorter throw, this isn't going to be like that. That being said, I think the real benefit of those gimbals is in helping people reach the corners. You actually lose resolution when you use those short throw gimbals. You lose precision, but you're able to make shorter stick movements. And personally, I don't find that I have any trouble going to the extents with these. Even if I were a thumber, I can get to the extents. And that makes sense because this is a straight rip of a Futaba radio, and Futaba did a pretty freaking good job with their ergonomics. Here's a feature of the gimbals that I've never seen on any radio before. If you turn this screw, it actually angles the gimbal outward, just rotates the whole gimbal inside its housing and angles it outward a little bit. I've never seen that. I'd have to play with that to see if I liked it, but I could see that angling the gimbal outward slightly might make it easier to push all the way into the corner, especially if you're a thumb pilot. So interesting touch there. A nice innovation, Jumper. Is that innovation? Fill up the comments with notes of where they actually stole this idea from. I do think that the stick ends are a little shorter than I would prefer. And in case you didn't know, you can do this on all gimbals really. You can just screw this out to the length that you prefer and then take this one and screw it up so it sort of cinches down against the other one like a double lock nut, and you can set the end however you want. By the way, you can also get custom stick ends if you prefer. For example, a lot of thumb pilots like the big wide sort of mushroom shaped stick ends, and these are M3 screws if you want to buy custom stick ends for it. If we look at the top of this radio, first of all, we'll see right here is where the USB port is. That lets you plug it into your computer and you can use it as a controller for your simulator if you want. You can also, of course, use that to back up your models, update firmware, and so forth. It uses OpenTX and it uses the same OpenTX companion software that every other OpenTX radio uses. But the thing I want you to notice here is what's not there, and that is there is no antenna coming out of the top. This radio does not have an internal RF module. And that's true for all the Jumper radios. They use this external multi-protocol module, and the reason they're doing that is that FrSky is not set up, or OpenTX is not set up to have an internal multi-protocol module. So they just say, well, we don't have an internal module. We'll just use our multi-protocol. This is fine. I don't hate this. In fact, this multi-protocol module is pretty freaking impressive. It can bind to FrSky, FlySky, Spektrum, Hubsan, like you name it, it can bind to it. It can bind to everything except Crossfire or R9, which means that if you have a mixture of every quad that I mentioned and Crossfire, you're going to be taking this guy out in order to change out your Crossfire module when you go fly. If you are like some pilots and you just have nothing but Crossfire, stick Crossfire in the back and you're good to go. If you don't have Crossfire or R9, you're good to go. But I wish that this had an internal multi-protocol module so I could then stick Crossfire in the back and I would be in freaking heaven, because now if I get a bind and fly with Spektrum or with iBus, FlySky, whatever, I can bind to it and I would just never have to take anything out of the back of my radio. It would be great. So I wish they would do that. You listening? Jumper? Come on, man. Give it to me. Now, the other thing that you're wishing I would do is test the range of this module, and actually, I kind of already have. When I reviewed the Jumper T12, it has the same multi-protocol chipset in it, and I found the range of that module to be equal to, or under my very non-rigorous test conditions, maybe a little bit better than the range of the Taranis X9D. So no hesitation about using this as a primary module if that's what you want to do. Now, this radio comes with a neck strap, and it is not good. This kind of, I've had neck straps with this kind of clasp before. It will break. It will betray you. Don't use it. But I did notice one thing. I was going to complain that it didn't have a balance bar either. You see, the Taranis needs a balance bar to allow the radio to hang flat so that when you hang it around your neck and don't hold it, it doesn't go thunk, right? And I was annoyed that the T16 didn't come with a balance bar, but I underestimated Jumper Futaba's excellent engineering, because the actual freaking neck strap lug is just in the right place so the radio hangs flat without the need for a balance bar, because of course it is, because that's how the radio should freaking be. Thank you, Jumper / Futaba. But no, seriously, don't use this neck strap. This thing will break. It'll break. It'll drop your radio and break it. The next thing that you're probably going to want to see me do is open this radio up and show you the internal build quality. Externally, it feels pretty solid. It's a little bit light, and it's really a shame that the battery rattles in there, although that's easy to fix. But overall, it feels pretty tight and pretty nice in the hand. None of that matters if the internal build quality is crap, if the soldering is bad, and etc. And I'm actually not going to do that because my friend Liviu Preda is planning to do a full teardown of this radio as soon as he gets one. In case you don't know, Liviu FPV, he's an FPV pilot and he flies pretty well. But what really makes him stand out is his electronics knowledge. He does electronics repair. He took apart and fixed a broken GoPro with like surface mount soldering. He fixes ES. Basically, if you have broken hardware, send it to him and he'll fix it. And I can't think of anybody more qualified, maybe Bruce Simpson, to open up one of these radios and comment on the build quality. I will say, though, I talked to him and he said from pictures that he's seen in other people's reviews, it looks pretty freaking good. So I'm going to leave the comment on the internal build quality at that. And when he actually does his full break teardown, I'll link to it down in the video description, maybe a couple weeks from now, though. Now we come to the part of the video that some of you guys don't give a crap about. If you don't care about politics and open source and cloning, if you just want to buy a radio, use it and enjoy it, you can skip past this part of the video. And in fact, I'll put a little timestamp down in the corner so you know how far to skip ahead to get past this part. The first thing that we have to acknowledge is that this radio is a straight carbon copy of the Futaba. It's the T16SZ, I think. It's a straight carbon copy of that radio. And no, in case you were wondering, Jumper did not license it from Futaba. They just copied it. If you have a problem with that, then don't buy this radio. If you don't have a problem with that, moving on. The other thing is that FrSky, and I think by extension, the OpenTX devs who work very closely with FrSky on a lot of projects, FrSky objects to this radio. Now, what could there possibly be to object to? Because this radio uses OpenTX, but OpenTX is an open source project, which means anyone can download it and use it, right? Isn't that the point of open source? And this radio is basically a carbon copy of the Taranis X10. In fact, if you look at it's got the same knobs. It's basically just took an X10 and remolded it into a Futaba, which kind of is why I like it so much, because I love the X10. I just didn't like the freaking ergonomics. FrSky, what were you thinking? Okay, back to the topic. I asked FrSky for a statement about this, and one of the things they said was, yes, OpenTX is open source, but open source does not mean the technology achievements of OpenTX can be completely copied. I don't think that's true. Open source means that I can take that code, I can compile it, and I can sell it. It absolutely does mean that. So I disagree with FrSky's objection to this radio. And I think that what we're running into here is a fundamental problem that occurs when an open source project becomes dominated by one commercial entity. And that commercial entity, in this case FrSky, relies heavily on the firmware. And the problem is that with the GNU public license, the GPL, it's very, very difficult to transition a GPL project from open to closed source legally. It's basically impossible. And so FrSky is still open source, but so OpenTX is still open source, but FrSky relies on it very heavily and wants to sort of protect it. They put a lot of development into it, but the problem is this. When FrSky came to the party, OpenTX already existed. FrSky has put work into it, but it is built on a foundation of free open source contributions, and you cannot build a closed proprietary fortress on top of a free open source GPL mountain. if you will. I made that up. That's mine. I made that analogy up. I like it. So what FrSky wants to do is lock out these competitors because they're putting a lot of work into OpenTX, but because they have built their fortress on top of an open source mountain, you cannot do that. I do not believe that Jumper has done anything wrong by building a radio to work with this free open source firmware. And I do not agree. I understand why FrSky is annoyed that a competitor is benefiting from their work. And if FrSky wants to not have that happen anymore, they have to write a whole new firmware from scratch, not based on open source foundations. And that is what FrSky has, a firmware. The OpenTX, the Horus X10S ships with FrSky OS, FROS on it. And the very first thing I do is I flash that crap off of there, and I mean, it's not crap, but I flash it off of there and I put OpenTX on it because OpenTX is awesome, and that's what all of you guys probably do as well. If FrSky wants to build their own closed source, then they can own it. But if you're going to base your product on an open source, you have to accept that your competitors will also benefit from your contributions. FrSky doesn't want to do that. I don't agree with them on that. The last thing to comment on before we wrap up this review is the software question. And so the OpenTX devs are not supporting this radio. Now, what's happened is that Jumper has forked OpenTX in the same way that Betaflight forked CleanFlight, right? That rings a bell for you. They've forked it and they're working on their own builds for this radio. Why don't the OpenTX devs support the radio? The short answer of that, in my editorial opinion, is that the OpenTX devs are very close to FrSky. They do a lot. One of the OpenTX devs is actually employed by FrSky, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at the end of the day, when it comes down to who they're going to work for, they seem to prefer FrSky. And I asked them for a statement, and the gist of the statement is, like, there's nothing nefarious going on here. It just so happens we're all working in our spare time on this project, and in order for us to support a radio, there's something that we need to do, that the vendor needs to bring to us, and it's not just paying us money, it's helping us with the development efforts. The bottom line is that OpenTX is not developing software for this radio. Jumper is. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how open source programs work. But if you buy this radio, you will be dependent on Jumper to produce firmware for you. Normally I would say, and that's a problem, because who knows if this Jumper company is going to be around a year from now and leave you high and dry with no firmware. But if you ask the customers of the Underground FPV Nirvana how they feel today about OpenTX or Underground FPV, they are not too keen on OpenTX, because OpenTX was supposed to release support for the Underground FPV Nirvana in OpenTX 2.3, which was supposed to be out a while ago, and it's still not out. And then they just now pushed development back to 2.4. So Underground customers who are counting on OpenTX are kind of high and dry. And meanwhile, Underground FPV is releasing firmware with updates constantly, the same way that Jumper is going to be doing for this radio. So it's a little bit of a toss-up whether you want to trust Jumper with the future of your radio, but it's no longer a foregone conclusion. If you don't have a FrSky radio, it is no longer a foregone conclusion that OpenTX will support you. I feel comfortable saying that. So then that brings us to the end of the review and the final question: should you buy it? And for many people who are watching this review, the answer is going to be yes. Absolutely yes. If you compare this to, well, this guy comes in at $160. If you compare it to something like the QX7 at $100 or $110, it's really better. It's got a much nicer screen. It's got a much nicer interface. The ergonomics on the QX7 are not great. It's kind of wide and it's kind of angular, same as the X10. It's got great ergonomics. It's got the same feature set. It can bind to FrSky and a whole bunch of other radios. It's just, I think this radio beats the QX7 in almost every way. And, oh, by the way, you don't need to do an inverter mod on this radio in order to do Crossfire with it. Thanks, FrSky, for nerfing that radio and pissing us all off. It's more expensive. That's about the only thing the QX7. If you have $100-ish to spend on a radio and no more, I think the QX7 is a fantastic choice, especially if you don't plan to use Crossfire and especially if you mostly plan to use FrSky radios. If you can get up to about $150 or $160, the T16 is a fantastic choice. If you then get up into the $200 price range, we've got the X9D. And what does the X9D really have that the T16 doesn't for $200? That's not the special edition with the M9 gimbals. That's like $250, $270. You can do FrSky and Crossfire at the same time without having to swap out modules. Okay. Yeah. And you can get Hall effect gimbals. And you can put in a big honkin' 3-cell that lasts for a few months. So, T16 is pretty freaking good. I will say though, for me, the lack of Hall effect gimbals is I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. I might switch and just swap. I hate swapping gimbals. I don't know. That's the final word for me. Seriously, Jumper, charge me $220 for a version of this radio with M9, with Hall effect gimbals and a built-in multi-protocol module so I can put Crossfire in the back. You'll have me. Hands down. Thank you so much for watching. Happy flying. I really wish it had Hall effect gimbals. I might fly it anyway. Here's the thing. I got it. I'm going to fly this thing for 6 months or 9 months. And then when the gimbals wear out, Jumper will have come out with a Hall effect. They know how to use Hall effect gimbals. Some of their other radios have Hall effect gimbals in them. I'm just going to use this thing until the gimbals wear out. And then when they wear out, they'll just have a new one and they'll send it to me. Yes, that's what I'm